Welcome to module number 12, focused on social emotional learning and equity and social justice leadership. So the first place we're going to start is with social emotional learning. Now, before we even get going with this whole module, I do want you to understand is that we all know that both these topics are huge and could be years of study all by themselves. But this is a real overview. I wish I could go in deeper with a few things, but I have interspersed videos throughout it just to try to deepen your learning on both the social emotional learning part, especially on the equity and justice part. So just know that this is a real overview. You will be tasked with many of these issues throughout your career as a school administrator, but we want to give you everybody just kind of a baseline understanding of everything that's there. So again, we'll start off with social emotional learning. Some of you may be experts in this already because you may be counselors, social workers, or some position that uses this consistently. But you'll hear people use the acronym SEL all the time, and it's social emotional learning. There is a group called the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning that are very influential in this work. And you can see that there's a link to their website. People just call them Castle. But the five core competencies that they look at are self-awareness, understanding your strengths and limitations, self-management, understanding how to manage stress, social awareness, just understanding what's going on around you and how other people may think, especially from diverse backgrounds and cultures. The relationship skills that are part of social and emotional learning and work, and then the responsible decision making based off of what you know about people and how to ethically make decisions based on the perspectives of others. These five skills are something that you're going to see interweaved throughout many curriculums that counselors will do, but also we're trying to integrate this more and more just in classroom management generally. And we'll talk about what classroom management means with this. But as we know, when we think about social emotional learning, a lot of the times in the past, when we heard classroom management, it meant baby, basically like sticks and carrots. How do you motivate kids with incentives or some type of consequences that they don't want to do because of those consequences? So social emotional learning is really trying to be proactive and really trying to teach and help kids actually make decisions independently. That would be the prime reason for social emotional learning. When we look at social emotional learning, it's at the center of many things, and we talked about the skills that Castle is talking about, but also this is not just about classrooms and schools. This builds out to homes and communities because the point is that we really do want students that come out of our schools to be thoughtful about others. How does their own behavior and own decision making affect others? And that doesn't just happen in the classrooms and schools, and that happens out in the homes and communities. And again, to go back to the old concept of classroom management, a lot of the times it was so focused on the classroom that a child might be making decisions within a classroom because the parameters are so tight. But once they get out of that classroom, they make decisions that they wouldn't have in that classroom. So, which means it's not translating into how they make decisions generally. And a lot of the focus on this is really trying to figure out how do we help students become independent decision makers that are thoughtful, culturally aware, not just when they're in schools and classrooms, but when they're out and about and as they grow up and mature. So social emotional learning really the crux of the question is how do we prevent our students from failing? And it doesn't mean just in school, but struggling throughout their life of making connections with people, understanding perspectives of others. So when we're thinking about this, this isn't just about the academics part of school. It's really about helping students again become emotionally aware of others and themselves and how to handle the stress that comes with that and the stress that comes with schooling, the stress that comes with outside of school, It's a really important concept for them to think about as they grow up. So, as with all things, there are criticisms of social and emotional learning being directly taught in schools. So, you could check out a couple pieces here. There's a couple perspectives. The SEL video is focused on what people really think about SEL in general in schools, about the positives it can bring for students and school environment and culture. But then there's also another side to that. There's a criticism of it and its connection to instruction. So, as an administrator, no matter what role you are, it might not be SEL, but it might be something else. It's always important to understand the other perspective, the criticism of whatever it is that you're trying to possibly put into place in a school district or are thinking about. Um, there's these pieces every day where we think that this seems like a simple decision, like everyone would agree with it. But there's always another perspective out there that may not agree with it. And it's important to understand that perspective. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. It's just important to understand it because when you are describing and defining the why behind a decision, or in this case, implementing some type of social emotional learning instruction, um, it helps you with defining your why, because if you know what the criticisms are, you can then look at your why and think, okay, so how can I answer this question for somebody that doesn't agree with me in this case? Now, they might not ever agree with it, but if they can at least understand the why, it might help them um, at least agree that we can implement it in their mind. And again, that doesn't always happen either, but it's important to understand the other side. So, social emotional learning, the reason these two were paired up with equity and social justice was because really at the baseline of social and emotional learning is understanding other people's perspectives and taking that into account when you're moving through life. Um, when we think of equity and social justice, this is so steeped in so many things we see from our policies, our grading, our the way we teach, the way we relate, the way we perceive assets and deficits in kids and families and communities in one another. This is such a huge topic. Again, this could probably be done in years of study. People have devoted their whole life to it. So we're just going to give a quick snippet, but you can check out a video in that 8th grade course. It's a really good example of how a teacher can work through that with kids. But we're going to step ahead here in the equity and social justice, just a really interesting topic that focuses on so many aspects of our schools, from culture to climate and beyond. So I want you to think just about 3 quotes here that I think are interesting. You know, which one of these quotes speaks to you most concerning equity and education of where you are right now in your, I would call it an equity journey, understanding other people's perspectives, understanding how our systems affect different families, different kids, and are our systems beneficial to all or just to some? And I think it's important to think about these quotes because they all hit it from a different direction, but one may speak more to you than others. So, um, equity and especially social justice, it's more than just being aware. There's, um, you can understand that there are large differences in academic outcomes between students based on their race, based on their socioeconomic status, based on their language, on so many different things, based on their gender. Um, but it's more than just knowing that that happens. It's about being thoughtful about how do we change that. So there are some, I would say, waves of understanding. The first one is being unconscious and unaware. And the concept of this is that we're all colorblind and that really there isn't anything there because everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and and achieve. Now, we all know that there are people that are able to do that. However, the question would be, are people or are some people better equipped or better able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps because of their race, because of their socioeconomic status? Do they have more opportunity to actually do that than others? When you're saying that somebody is colorblind, sometimes I think people have thought about that as saying, like, I treat everyone the same, it is an important concept with that. However, people are unique, and it is important that we understand that and that people come from different perspectives, because you can tailor your leadership, you can tailor your teaching in a way that best meets everybody's needs then, if you know that people are different and recognize that in a proactive and positive way. Then there's unconscious and aware. A person in this category would understand that there's something out there that's unjust or inequitable, but they're not really sure how to change it and don't really have an interest in it. And just say, the concept of it is what it is always comes to my mind when I think about people within this category. They understand that it's there, but they don't have a huge interest in changing it because it might push them out of their comfort level. And that's where they sit, as it is what it is. Conscious and aware. So these are people that they know that there are injustices and equity, both for an individual student and just organizationally. So there may be bias, racism, classism, whatever it might be within policy that's integrated into it, probably not on purpose, but within school districts, it's still there and it's benefiting certain families and certain kids and community members more than others. And they are trying to take action against it, both personally and through the organizational leadership, which many of you are, when you're looking at school leadership, is probably one of the pieces that is driving you to do that. Now, the question that always happens is, yes, I know it's there. I don't, but what do we do about it? It's such a huge, issue that we're trying to work through. And in the end, you have to take one piece at a time. And understanding how a classroom could look or how a system could look is important, because you can take a piece and say, we're going to focus on this area right now. And we're going to make sure that we're trying to be as equitable and socially just as possible through this. And these two articles are really interesting pieces because they just kind of show what you can look for in classrooms, what you can look for within your system. I know many of you have seen this graphic before. It's when you're trying to explain the idea of what's the difference between equity and equality, because a lot of the times they're used interchangeably and they're actually very, very different. Because equality is more about sameness, not really fairness. Because you're giving everybody the same thing, but they're starting off at different points, which means that it's not really that equal or equitable. When we think about equitable, it's about understanding where a person is and then providing the access they need to make sure that they have similar opportunities to the others around them. And as you can see, I know you've seen this probably a lot of times, this graphic, but in the equality, when everyone's given the same level of box to stand on, but obviously depending on where you start, it still doesn't allow certain people to see the game or to understand what's going on. Whereas in equity, you're looking at saying, okay, this is where the person's starting. What do they actually need to see the game or be part of this organization or the society? And we're going to give them that. The other graphic, which I thought was interesting, is the idea of liberation is really removing the fence for all and allowing people to be completely free because we've removed the barriers. And when I think about equity and social justice, for me, that's what always sticks out, is that we're removing barriers. If we're truly looking at systemic change, is that all barriers are removed and all people have a very equitable way of seeing what they can do to improve themselves and improve the people around them and improve their community. So when I think about asset-based thinking, this is something that's really, really important to think through. If you think about our systems in schools, if you're honest about the thoughtful process of a structure of any sort, PBIS, MTSS, whatever it might be, multi-tiered support, um, a lot of the times it's really focused in deficit thinking. And what I mean by that is you look at a student and say, what do we need to improve with this student? What are they lacking? That typically sometimes is the first question, especially in a lot of our systemic pieces. Um, and we have to start flipping that to a point where we're saying, what can the student do? Why can they do it? And what can we learn from their strengths and their abilities to actually improve the areas that they need to grow in? And flipping that around a bit. Because a lot of the times you can really gain an insight to say, wow, this child is really good at math. Why is that? Maybe it's motivation, maybe it's how they think through it, and maybe you can take that way of thinking and transition it to reading where they might be struggling. The other part of this is it forces people to look at students and understand that a lot of the times deficits are sometimes connected to race, socioeconomic status, and people will say very similar things to, boy, when they go home, I just feel bad for them because, the home structure is this way or they don't have a lot at home, which is all important to understand. It is very, very important to be thoughtful, empathetic to that, and know that you're going to have to adjust things to it. But that should not be your first thought about who that child is. Because if you're in that thought process of saying, well, these are all the reasons why I don't think they can do it, or what's holding them back that's out of your control, that's the thing. It's out of your control. It's good to know, but what can we do here at school to really focus on their strengths and build them up, build their confidence, build their idea of who they are, and really use that to our advantage? So we focus on the strengths of the student, focus on the strengths to build the areas of growth. And the one thing that I always say that I think Shiraki Holly, if you've ever read any of his books, he says, combat stereotypes in your first thought. And what that means is a lot of the times human nature, the first thought is, unfortunately, the criticism or negative or the deficit base. Like, well, yeah, but this is what happens. Or I've seen their home and this is, or their mom this, and it's your first thought. Now that might pop into your head, unfortunately, but you have to kind of combat that with saying, okay, that's my first thought, but what are my other thoughts after that? How can we build this student up? What can we use that's strong that we can build their deficits that unfortunately sometimes are our first thought? What can we use in those strengths to build up the other areas? If you can start conversations with assets of a student rather than the deficit, it allows for a much deeper discussion about strategies. Because unfortunately, a lot of the discussions that start with deficit thought end up being very focused on things you can't control. And I'm sure many people that are listening to this have been in those discussions, with IEPs or student support discussions, whatever it might be, that the first thing that kind of people talk about are a lot of things they can't control. So what I always like to do, especially as a principal, was saying, all right, tell me about this child, what they're really good at. What do you love about them? And to me, that changes the whole atmosphere around that discussion. Now, you can still talk about those things that are a challenge for the child that is out of our control, just to be aware of it, but that should not dominate the conversation. So we're going to do a little practice with asset-based thinking and equity. There's a video that's attached here and will be in your resources as well called Tammy's Story for People Like Us, from People Like Us. What it was there's a series of documentaries, about 10 or 12, I believe, on PBS a while ago, say 10 years or so, that basically the point of the documentary series was to just dive into different people's lives from different socioeconomic statuses from different races, different language backgrounds, and really dive into people's lives and kind of show what's going on, and maybe giving people a different perspective. It's a really interesting series, again, called People Like Us. This one is called Tammy's Story. It's really focused on socioeconomic status. Tammy is in the lower socioeconomic status. She is a single mom with two boys that are older, and they're in high school or middle school. And what I want you to do is, when you watch this video, the tendency for human nature is to watch it and think like, wow, that's really rough. Which, there are parts of it that are, but instead of that, I want you to look at the whole video through the lens of asset-based thinking. So what assets does Tammy possess as a mom? What assets do each of her sons possess? As an educator, think about why it's important to understand these specific assets and how you engage a family similar to this in education and school. And how does this relate to social justice work in schools? When you really think about this from an asset-based, what can you take from Tammy and her family? And think about, wow, these are real strengths of that family. What can we do in order to harness that and actually make school a better place for these, for Tammy's family and Tammy herself? It's a really interesting look at it if you look at it from that lens and really push yourself to do that, because sometimes your brain will go in a different direction. So we know that many of you have looked at probably your own district outcomes, national outcomes, state outcomes throughout it. There continues to be large disparities, and these are just some of them. There's many others. There's disparities between low-income students and middle and upper-class students, Latino students and white students, African American students and white students, English language learners and first language English speakers. Disability gaps, gender gaps, and then there's sometimes a mixture of that, where it's a gender and race gap and socioeconomic gap. And if a student has all three, where they might be African American, male, and they are of low socioeconomic status, those three things together, typically those outcomes are very wide between them and maybe a white student in middle class socioeconomic status. So these are the things that we just have to be very, very aware of, and not just be aware, but actually take action as leaders. And what are the little things you can do to really take a look at this from an equity lens? And is there something within your structure, within how we relate to certain students, how we build relationships? What is it that we're missing in these areas? And what can we do to build off the strengths we do see and try to bring equity among these outcomes? And as we know, there are so many patterns that are shifting demographically within schools, within society, within communities. And you always have to be very, very aware of those shifts. And how can we prepare ourselves to be as strong as possible when those shifts happen, and predict them and be proactive and say, okay, so, we're starting to see this shift socioeconomically in our community or in our language status, whatever it might be. How do we predict those and really start becoming proactive and looking at our systems prior to shifts demographically, so we can make sure our systems are ready for that and really promote equity as those shifts happen? This article is an interesting one just because it just talks about challenges. It already starts off with a deficit view a bit, but it does give you a perspective on the changing demographics within the state, and what's being seen there. And you can start probably looking at your communities themselves and see how that same shift has happened there. So the big question is, what must we do as leaders? Not an easy answer, as you know. And the thing that I am going to introduce you to is just one concept that many of you might actually be experts in already, but we're going to be talking a little bit about restorative justice, because to me, that's where it starts with a lot of equity work, is the relationships we build with students, especially during challenging times. Students get to see if we believe in them, see if we make judgment on them before before they are given their chance to give their perspective. And this could work in a disciplinary ways, obviously, with behavior, which we know there's a lot of disparate outcomes with that between race, socioeconomic status, gender, language within behavior, and how we provide guidance with behavior. There's many disparate outcomes there. But this also, restorative justice concept also really works with the challenges that students have with one another and with the adults in the building, and can really be what I would say, healing process for years of students that feel like they weren't given equitable ability to succeed. And it also builds a large trust between students and between students and staff, even when they don't agree. Because many times what we've done is created a culture or a climate where students don't feel heard. And we sometimes, in my mind, don't give them enough credit for the perspectives they bring and what they can do to actually help a school move forward in their equity work, just by listening to students and having them part of many processes. And restorative justice is a good step towards that. And the concepts within it, you might not even be able to go full-fledged restorative justice, but there are concepts within it that I think can really help a leader understand how best to create a climate where students are given their voice and given the ability to really show what we could do better as school leaders and schools. So again, like I was saying, is restorative justice is just it's an approach to dealing with conflict that's not punitive, but emphasizes accountability and reconciliation. The word offender I struggle with, but it's part of the restorative justice work. So it's where someone has made a mistake, and we're looking at trying to help them understand, how that mistake affected others, what you can do to reconcile that with the people that may have been hurt through it. It can help change discipline to a learning opportunity. Restorative justice is linked to a much larger movement within the country where we're trying to figure out, not just for students, but adults as well, is how do we help them reintegrate, and how do we help them find the accountability that we need them to understand to help them kind of mature in their thinking process of the people around them, but also to help the people that may have been hurt by it understand that the person that hurt them is a human being too, that made a mistake, and that we can still heal and fix those situations between human beings. This is just a good overview video of it, of restorative justice, so that gives you a sense for what it's all about, what you can do within a school or within an environment to really access the different concepts within restorative justice. So there's some questions that are pretty major to restorative justice that drive most conversations and strategies is, what was the harm done? How can it be repaired? And who's responsible for that repair? Straightforward questions, big conversations. Now, if you think about how we've done things before, when we think about discipline in schools, or just working through a challenge, because a lot of times even challenges of difference of opinions and stuff, it seems like we're always looking for who's wrong and what we should do for that person that's wrong. So when we think about restorative justice, it's understanding what the harm was and how to have that person repair that harm. Retributive justice, sorry, is more of trying to figure out what rule was broken, who broke that rule or law, and how should they be punished. It's a much different conversation, because there's not even a question of that typically, where it's how do we help that person repair whatever harm was done. So critical assumptions of restorative justice. Poor behavior is defined best as a violation of people, not law or rule. So what it is many laws, if you really think about it in rules, are to help people think, not to hurt the people around them. But when we think about restorative justice, that's very clear that it's a violation of the people around you. It's, yes, there might be a broken law or rule, but it's behind that is harm done to a human being. Um, a lot of the times, people that offend should be accountable, but not only to authorities, but to those whom they have harmed. So it's, and to themselves. So they're responsible to themselves, and to the people around them. They're not responsible so much to the principal or the person in authority. Now, the person in authority obviously works with them to do it, but they should understand that actually they're accountable to those people around them, especially the people they caused harm to. Um, Both the victims and the communities are given a direct role in seeking justice. So those are tough conversations sometimes, because um, the person that's hurt um, may really want the person that offended to understand their harm, and they may do that in a way that sometimes comes off as very challenging, very angry, which are all completely legitimate feelings. And within this process, it does help people work through those feelings and then come to more of a concept of looking for justice throughout the process. So you're constantly balancing the needs of the victims, offenders, communities, and authorities. Now, sometimes the process doesn't always work perfectly. So then you have to balance the needs and say, okay, I really need to look out for this component, because right now we're not moving forward. We got to make sure that we honor those people that are part of this process. So, a brief summary, as you can see, this is kind of a Venn diagram, but you're looking for reparation with the victim, under having the offender understand the responsibility, and then both the victim and the offender understand that the community around them cares, and they're looking for ways to reconcile and kind of fix the harm. This one does a great job of just showing the middle point, like what is truly restorative justice. It's peace circles, so the circles are bringing all affected together, bringing um, community representatives into that circle to show how that whatever happened can affect the community or may have affected the community, bringing in family groups from home that can kind of help understand the bigger process, because a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, some of the times the harm brought to a victim also affects their family, depending on the situation that was happening throughout it. So this is a nice diagram just to understand how those three things fit together to provide restorative justice practices. So the basic kind of left to right progression is something happened that was misconduct. There is repercussions to that, and that doesn't always mean consequences as like suspension, detention, whatever it might be. And those are part of it. But the repercussions people have to understand is that it's really about the personal repercussions to, again, the people are within the situation that are more important than the consequence itself. Um, After having some of that discussion, both on the immediate and then bringing the community together in restorative circles, it's reestablishing relationships. And then really the goal is to alter disciplinary trends. Because again, the more we connect people with one another, understanding perspectives, understanding how your behavior affects those people around you, the more thoughtful the culture will be, and it will actually curtail discipline into the future, um, or broken relationships because of how people treated one another within that culture and climate of school or beyond. And again, this is about lifelong um, strategies for kids and adults within a building. Um, so it's not just about the here and now, which is important, but it's also about the future and helping that person connect. So there's different models. There's mediation, where the teacher and staff are trained to mediate between the victims of offense and offender. There's community group conferencing. This is for much more serious offenses that affect large groups of people, and um, this may bring in law enforcement, which sometimes, again, this is a bigger question around equity. As we know, is that the relationship between um, police officers and some of our community members is not good, and it's very strained. So this is something you have to take into account when you're thinking through a process like this, because if it is that serious where law enforcement is involved, it's you almost have to plan with a law enforcement officer about how best to involve them, depending on the situation, depending on the members within the circle. The circle process, again, this is a very big overview, so this is not meant to be a strict training, just an example of a strategy you can use to look at equity and social justice within your school. But the circle process is open, it's facilitated about a specific incident or general issue the community needs to address by trained teachers or staff members that can understand how to facilitate sometimes a highly emotional issue. So again, defining restorative justice, you're looking at it's a disciplinary reform, it's a cultural reform, it's a teaching reform, pedagogical, that all fits into this, and that's why it's such a powerful strategy and why we focus on it in this little module, is to say, like, a lot of the times we're not sure what strategy to put in place first for social justice and equitable work, and this is an important strategy that's been proven to work and something that you can start with, even if it's just one piece at a time. So when we think about the victim offender mediation part of restorative justice, it does give an opportunity for victims to tell how the incidents affected them, constructively express their feelings to offenders, and this is where a trained facilitator is really important to have, because those emotions can be very high depending on the situation. It allows them to ask questions and receive answers that only the offender can provide, like, why did you do this? How did you think this was going to make me feel? That you can get directly from the offender instead of just guessing at it. It also experiences having a direct voice and participation in the justice process instead of, you get the question a lot, especially as like a school administrator. Well, what happened to the other person? Like, people are looking for, this happened to me, now I want to know the consequence. This actually gives people people the ability to be a part of the process, not so much the handing out of consequences, but understanding that they are having direct influence on the conversation, and that they're not just a passive bystander, even though they were directly affected by this in a negative way. It also helps them heal through restoration, because we do give, obviously, the ability to the offender to reconcile the issue with the person that was the victim. So this is a bigger picture, again, when we're looking at the mediation. It's not just in schools, but really how we're hoping society continues to move towards having a restorative practice between community members at times. So when we think about what it does for offenders, it gives them the opportunity to more fully understand the impact of their offense upon the lives of the person that was affected. It helps them explain their involvement in it, take responsibility, convey regret directly. And again, a facilitator is huge here, because a lot of the times those emotions are high and a person can become very defensive, and it's how do you work through that. It helps the offender also experience emotional healing and moving forward, because many times there is a sense of shame and guilt. And if we're not able to help the offender move through that, that could affect them into the future and how they make decisions too. And then it also allows them to have a direct voice and participation in the justice process. Just to understand, how, again, what they did affected others, but also how it's going to affect them into the future. It also adds opportunities for school community to respond to the needs of the victims as they see them, supports offenders while encouraging them to understand and accept their obligations and responsibilities. it allows community members to be involved in the restorative justice process, and it increases the capacity to recognize and respond to the school community for school leaders as well. Because if you're a school leader and you're a part of these circles and you start seeing a theme of some sort between students, that's when you can start understanding, like, okay, so we have this issue that seems to be an ongoing issue that we're having circles around. How can we bring a larger circle together and say, how do we handle this as a school community? And that's really where the strategy comes into play, is that you're not just involving just a few people, you're actually highly involving students in the change process. Especially as students get older, they actually are craving that. They might not always act like it, but they are looking for ways to make their school and community better. They want to be proud of it. And I'm sure many of you have heard students when they go in the community or are talking to their friends from other schools, they're very proud of their school and they want to be. And the restorative justice practices just aren't about um, handling consequences and handling discipline issues and behavior issues. It really is about building a larger community and system around the ideas that we are all in this together, and we are going to work through the challenges we have because we are human beings, and we are going to challenge one another, and we are going to hurt one another from time to time. And in those times, though, that's where strength is built, is how do we handle the times where we harm. And what ends up happening is it builds people's confidence in the system. It builds people's confidence in one another, and they know that they are thinking of one another and have one another's backs. And when we really think about social justice and equity, that's a huge baseline issue, is do people understand one another? Do they understand that other people's perspectives, and how are those perspectives taken into account when decisions are made or a direction is being taken within a school? And if we can have that as a strength and stronghold within schools, that we understand perspectives, we understand how to handle challenges, that will go a long way in helping people to continue to think about other people's perspectives in every decision they make, both from a policy perspective and from a day-to-day decision making. And finally, just circles. Circles are used in a variety of forms. This is something you can put into place even not having a complete restorative justice plan or program or training, is that when a circle discussion concerns a specific incident, the focus is usually on having the broader student community have an opportunity to share how this affects them. Because it's not just about the offender and the victim, it's also about how other people affected them as well. They either saw it, made them feel unsafe, whatever it might be. It's good to bring other perspectives in, because people have to understand it's not just between two people or three or four. It might be affecting large amounts, and how do we bring other voices into that so people can see that? And again, when it becomes a more general issue where you start seeing a theme and you want to bring a circle together and say, what can we do about this? It might be more of a dialogue process. Like, what as a student do you see? What as a teacher do you see? Or what as a staff member do you see? And what are we missing here? And how do we fix this together? Is there some type of reconciliation that has to happen between a group of people? And it might be even be between staff and students, that there's something sticking between them that has to be reconciled, and provided an ability to voice opinions and understand what is the next step, and handling that perspective the best we can. So again, when we think about defining restorative justice, this is just a simple graphic where it's really about control and support. When there isn't a lot of control and not a lot of support, we're being neglectful. When we basically release all control and say, well, it's not my issue and I'm not going to really support it, it's just letting it happen. When the control is really high and there's not a lot of support, it's just punitive. That means that's where we're relying completely on consequences to change culture and climate in a school. And to handle, again, the social justice part of this, control and punitive does not lend itself to reconciliation and moving forward with strategies that are going to help or prevent it from happening again. When control is low but support is high, it's more permissive. And what I mean by that is A lot of the times, if we say, well, we can't really do much, but we're going to give a lot of support to somebody, to victims and offenders, it really doesn't get to the root of the issue and does not allow for true healing, because we're just basically kind of sending people off independently with strategies, but not really ever dealing with it between them. And then finally, when you have people feel that they have a lot of control and a lot of support, they feel that highly motivated and feel like their perspective has been taken into account, and that leads to restorative justice. So just a quick story here. I won't read it because I think you can as you go, but this is just a very simple story that I find interesting because this is a common theme among teachers or staff and students when they really get into the restorative practice, and it becomes a true culture of a building. Now, again, this slideshow does not provide you with a deep, deep training of restorative justice. It just kind of points you in that direction, that it might be something that you explore, especially as you're working through social justice, equitable issues, and outcomes within your school, because this will set a baseline of trust between staff, students, and community, which is the baseline and the bedrock to a strong culture, which eventually leads to equitable outcomes in a school. There's other strategies that you can use too, but this is the one that kind of ties in social emotional learning because of the restorative aspect of it, and also ties in equitable outcomes and social justice because it's all about finding people's perspectives and building relationships. Thank you for your time. I hope you learned a lot here, but again, these are two large topics that you will be working through on a day-to-day process, even sometimes when you don't recognize it. Equitable issues or social justice and social and emotional learning will pop up on an everyday basis if you're aware of it. And then really the next step for people is not just to be aware, but what can we do about it if it's a theme that seems to be putting a barrier in front of our students or staff to truly, truly having equitable and high outcomes for all students. Thanks.